After entering human territory, the Mugansloot fleet simply sits there, begging for assistance from the humans that sat around the planet. The only thing they received back was a mechanical warning. This is sovereign human territory. Leave, or you will be destroyed. Which happened over and over and over again. For 8 hours, they continued to ask for help, any type of assistance, but no response, just the recording. The human ships had initially moved. They got in position between the fleet and the planet itself. This was barely any battle group. 3 destroyers, 6 frigates, which were set up to be drone carriers, 4 destroyer escorts, and that was it. That's all they had. This was a colony world, so they didn't put a lot into their defense. Though even with such meager forces, the Mugen fleet did not want to push their luck. They had already got the crap kicked out of them for the past few months, and they did not want to pick a fight with a new species, especially one that had a very interesting reputation. Eventually, it wasn't just the cruiser or frigates or any others for the Mugensoon fleet that was sending distress calls. It was the other ships, the shuttles, the cargo vessels that were just sending all sorts of distresses, begging for help as they were full of starving refugees. To prove their point, they sent a video, several in fact. 3D images filled the screens inside the human ships of all sorts of young and old and wounded, all clearly emaciated, many of them barely clinging on to life as it was, and some who just had broken. Physically, mentally, spiritually, didn't matter, they were just broken. Eventually, they received a message from the human ships. They could stay in human space, but they were not to land on any planet. They wanted to know if they could go and retrieve any supplies, and received a very mechanical message. Supplies will be brought to you. Do not land on the planet. To their absolute surprise, within an hour, supply ships actually showed up and docked with the ships. One by one, they started getting loading up with all sorts of supplies, as those who were crew members tried desperately to patch their ships, as at this point they were held together with little bits of wire and good intentions. The full weight of the issue was shown to the humans, though those inside the fleet did not know that they were being recorded. The recordings were set up so that those on the human ships and the planets would see the actual situation on board the ships. The humans set up a strange speaker along with a projector. On the projector, placed against the wall, they could see what each of the resources was, how to open each section, and what they could and couldn't eat, what it was for, as it was clear they wouldn't be able to learn the language. Though it was clear to see what was going on, one thing they didn't see at all was humans. No human faces, no human hands, no human anything. They simply saw cartoons or animated images moving around, showing them exactly how to open each of the containers and what they could use for what purpose. This was clearly translated into their language, but still had that strange mechanical voice. No emotion, no raising or lowering in pitch. It was just there. The refugees didn't care. The fact that many of them were going to get food for the first time in almost 2 weeks was something that they were not going to argue with. Not only that, there was enough water on board to keep them hydrated for several weeks. There was also medical supplies, though they had almost no idea how to use it or if it would be effective. Still, bandages work no matter what species there is. 4 hours plus after receiving the first round of aid, warp signatures were being detected. The only thing anyone heard around the fleet was, "Sir, we have incoming!" Massive fleet signatures were coming. Everyone was suddenly on edge as every single ship, it didn't matter if it was Mugensoot or human, suddenly seemed to maneuver in a way that put themselves between wherever the warp signatures were coming in and the planet itself. They watched as the fleet began to arrive, dropping out of their warp and seemingly sliding into the area as they decelerated. More and more ships began to arrive, and it was clear that this was the fleet that they had just got away from. The Muggensloot were absolutely petrified at what they saw. 5,350 ships had shown up. This was completely filling up their LiDAR display as they saw at least 24 different dreadnoughts, 26 battleships, 22 heavy cruisers, 211 destroyers, and just more. They just kept showing up. The fleet was so large it almost seemed to dwarf the planet. The Muggensloot simply turned to face the enemy. What was left of their cruiser and their destroyers and frigates turned to face the enemy as the cargo ships that were holding the refugees turned and tried to get away. One signal came from the cruiser. One phrase, translated, "Protect our people." They went out to face this fleet against all odds with barely a dozen ships at their command, and they knew that they would be fighting against the inevitable. The enemy fleet called out to the humans. "We only want the traitors, the refugees, those who cower in your space. Their fates belong to us, not yours. Surrender them." There was no answer from the humans. The only thing that the approaching fleet heard was that same automated voice telling everyone that they needed to leave and this was sovereign human territory. "Surrender them, or we will take them by force, and if need be, we will take you by force." Again, no answer, just the repeat over and over again. The enemy fleet, once fully assembled, began to move ever so slowly, trying to keep themselves in formation. It seemed as though they were very wary as they entered human space. Yet there was no movement from the human ships that they could see, none whatsoever. They couldn't figure out what was going on. The friendly aliens began to move forward as they prepared their desperate last charge to slow this advance. They couldn't stop it, but maybe they could slow it. The enemy forces began to charge their weapons and everybody started targeting each other. That's when one single human ship fired a single shot from its bow-mounted cannon. This shot flew right past the Muggensloot resistance and right past one of the dreadnoughts of the approaching fleet. A message came in from the humans. A mechanical voice went across. "Asylum request has been granted. Current refugees have been granted asylum under the protection of the Human Space Force Navy. Leave this territory now before you are considered an enemy of humanity. If you are and continue to advance, you will be destroyed." The enemy fleet didn't even seem to catch the message as they continued to advance. The human weapons were clearly getting ready to fire. "Final warning. Leave or be destroyed." That would be the last message anyone heard before the shooting began. As the battle began, the frigates began to deploy their drones as these frigates were sectioned off specifically as drone carriers. They did not carry the massive amount of torpedoes and missiles you would expect from a frigate. No, these were designed specifically as carriers. The drones got clear of the frigates themselves and began their jumps towards the enemy, but they could only get so close. The massive amount of ships meant that there was a huge amount of electromagnetic interference which denied their ability to jump into the fleet. They could get close. They could still make a mess of things. However, they would still be flying into the fleet instead of just appearing and forcing their point defense cannons to try and freak out, shoot their own ships. The drones were still flying into the formation, though many of them were being taken down before they could integrate themselves into the fleet and start dropping all their munitions, firing their main gun, and making an unholy mess. The destroyers sent up a whole bunch of chaff in a way to protect the frigates themselves, since the frigates are rather light as carriers go, and they would easily be taken down by a few hits. The chaff itself was simply a broad spectrum of different type of reflective material. This would make it almost impossible for the enemy to land a direct hit. It breaks up the sensors and also makes it impossible for anyone to get a full-on view. They then jump in with the friendly forces. Though they can't get any closer due to the electromagnetic interference, they can still jump, make micro jump, and then they begin to fire. They began to fire full-on broadsides, flipping and moving, making their turrets spin constantly, trying to get a good lock on the enemy. Destroyers did have a lot of guns on them, on all 6 sides, but that didn't matter much when you're facing this many forces. The helmsmen were doing everything they could to duck, dip, dive, dodge, roll over, flip, and anything they could to not take a hit. They continued to blast until they realized that the fleet was not slowing down. If anything, a few of them were beginning to go broadside as they brought many of their fixed weapons to bear. This was trouble. If they fired on full barrage, they'd be able to take down most of the forces just by chance. One of the destroyers decided, screw that, and charged the line. As the rest continued to move about and tried desperately to pick off some of the enemy forces, the HSN Johnston drove towards the line at full speed, using micro jumps to get close every time it was fired upon. It would simply blink and then move just a few kilometers in a different direction, trying desperately to make sure it could get its few remaining ordnance on target. It got closer and closer to the front line, obviously pissing off the forces as many of them began to pull themselves out of formation, a few of them ending up shooting each other because of this. But as the Johnston got close, it let loose its torpedoes in a huge barrage towards the largest dreadnought. And then he turned to run like hell. The others, seeing this, began to follow suit as they began to charge the line. They went straight past the Johnston as it was firing desperately, trying to get clear. And as the humans were drawing almost all the fire, the Mugen sloop cruiser was noted by stating, "What the hell are those crazy humans doing?" The torpedoes, though armored, were lost at 50% by the time they struck the dreadnought. However, this would be enough. They bored deep inside the vessel and then exploded. This resulted as the bow of the ship was actually blown clean off and separated. The secondary explosion started ripping through corridor, hallway, and chamber as they went through the entire ship, forcing it to be disabled. And then it went adrift. As it went adrift, the Johnston was running as it saw the other destroyers trying to get close to make their own attacks. It immediately spun itself around, doing a complete flip, and began to fire, saying, "Screw it, if we're going down, we're taking you bastards with me." They continued to jump and fire as best they could, as the Johnston joined its sister ships as it began to fire into them. And though they had extremely heavy damage being taken, as they could not dodge all the fire, as random shots would hit them and pierce their hull or damage it in some way, shape, or form, they continued to go in closer and closer to launch their torpedoes. The closer they were, the higher the chance of success, and every shot counts. After the Johnston's second run, it tried to pull away, only have one weapon firing at that point. Trying desperately to move, unfortunately it had taken so much damage it couldn't jump anymore. It tried to use its maneuvering thrusters, but most of them were simply gone, and the ship would not last much longer. The rest of the task force was not doing much better at all, as they had expanded all their missiles and torpedoes, and all the drones were just gone. They were getting shredded by incoming fires. They continued to try and jump, fire a volley, flip, burn, fire again, jump any way they could. But they just could not keep going. The explosions around them kept rocking the ship sideways. The crew were getting thrown around, many of them feeling their bones crack inside as they vomited all over the place from the sudden G-forces, yet they continued to go, simply wiping clean their consoles and keep on going. The Allied vessels were either destroyed or completely disabled at this point. They were going to be of no help to the human, and the enemy fleet saw this. They smelled blood in the water, and we all know what sharks do when there's blood in the water. The enemy fleet advanced towards the planet, trying to get itself in formation again. The transport, seeing this, tried to hide behind the planet itself or behind one of the 3 moons. The enemy fleet was not going to allow this, and they simply began to target the transports. When one of the transports burst into a gigantic fireball, the human ships stopped running. They would learn really quick that if you target the innocent, humans are going to get very agitated and do something very stupid. Inside one of the last human destroyers, there was absolute complete chaos as everybody was screaming what was going wrong. Hull breaches, weapons running hot or running out of ammo. The helm was constantly pulling back the yoke, trying to hold on to different types of levers and buttons, trying desperately to move the ship in any sort of way. The damage was mounting as they could see on their screen. Different breaches were happening. People were getting sucked out into the ether, or one of the gun emplacements would get struck and would blow off. They knew they were in deep, but if they were going to go down, they're going to take down as many of these alien assholes as they can get. That's when alarms started blaring, but this was a different type of alarm than what was already going off. This was a proximity alarm. This only goes off if something is coming in. The captain turned and screamed over to his comms officer, "More hostiles?" He simply turned and grinned and said, "No, sir." Within moments, a full-on human battleship blinked in with their support group. This meant that with the battleship, there was 8 destroyers, 12 frigates, and 36 corvettes. The humans, still facing off against the enemy fleet, trying desperately not to get tagged by one of their stray shots, heard a message over their comms. "This is Admiral Halsey. To all friendly forces, if you don't want to get cooked, get the hell out of the way." The friendly forces heard this and immediately began to get the hell out between this battleship and the enemy forces. They could see the main gun charging up. The enemy began to turn its weapons to face off against this battleship. And then they fired. The resulting energy beam streaked through the air, and within less than 2 seconds, it struck the enemy battleship clean. And as the beam dissipated, everyone could see there was a giant hole in the battleship as parts of it began to explode with secondary bursts of decompression. The enemy fleet saw this and seemed to hesitate. And then they tried to turn and run. The main gun fired again, this time splitting an enemy cruiser in half, and the enemy couldn't get the hell out of there fast enough. Several of the ships crashing into each other as they tried to turn their ships, as they needed to be in the direction of their warp to actually get the hell out of there. And then the skies were quiet. Inside the battleship, the XO turned to the Admiral. "Do we pursue?" "Negative. Send a message to the fleet. This is a recovery mission now." And as they started to move, he yelled out, "And get me in contact with the planetary governor. I want to know what the hell is going on right now." The only thing he got from his comms officer was, "Aye, sir."